So this video has been a little while in the making. In fact, you could say it's potentially been a few years in the making. A number of years ago, I recorded a video on the channel. It was a brief video, and the video title was Peak Mike Tyson versus Peak Lennox Lewis. We're going to revisit that topic in a bit more detail in this video. Obviously I made that video a number of years ago. The channel has moved on since then. To be frank, I've watched a lot more boxing since then. I've certainly watched a lot more 80s, 90s boxing since then. So we'll give it a different go and hopefully we'll do a bit more of an in-depth job on it. Before getting started, let me give two shout outs. One to Firaz, who once again has requested the video. He's been a big supporter of the channel for a long time now, and I appreciate another interesting request and your patience in terms of me getting around to filming it, because I've had a few goes at this one. I also want to give a shout out to another Patreon supporter, our official sponsors of the channel, Fine Web Design, and please do check out their website, which is linked in the description box below, finewebdesign.online. But without further ado, let's turn our attention to the question of a peak Mike Tyson versus peak Lennox Lewis. Let's actually pan just sideways for a second onto that first video that I did. That first video that I did several years ago, some of the real long-term viewers of this channel may remember it. I'm talking to real long-term viewers of this channel. But in that video, I focused a lot of my analysis on the actual fight between Lennox and Mike Tyson. And that was the actual fight that took place in 2002. And my in brief analysis within that video was that with Mike Tyson's style, even though it was an aging Mike Tyson, even though it was a bit of a shell of Mike Tyson, that Mike Tyson was still able to cause Lennox Lewis some stylistic problems early on in the fight. He was able to show that even an aging Mike Tyson could potentially get on the inside of Lennox Lewis and potentially pose a threat to Lennox Lewis. Now, whilst Lennox Lewis was very dominant in that fight and won that fight in a one-sided fashion, my brief analysis from a few years ago was that Tyson potentially showed enough in that fight in order to show that a Tyson at his peak would be able to have a lot more effect and be able to get Lennox Lewis hurt and get Lennox Lewis out of there. So that was the analysis from a few years ago. I've watched a lot more peak Tyson since then. I've also watched a lot more peak Lennox since then. So let's revisit it now. Maybe we'll keep the same conclusion. Maybe we'll change the same conclusion. But if we do turn our attention to that 2002 fight and again briefly analyse some of the key takeaways from that fight, Lewis destroyed Mike Tyson in that fight. Tyson was competitive round one. From then onwards, really, Lewis started to come into the fight, started to take over, and proved to be by far the better man on the night. But the question that we're looking at today is a peak Mike Tyson versus a peak Lennox Lewis. Not a 2002 Mike Tyson versus a 2002 Lennox Lewis. Realistically, that 2002 fight was the shell of Mike Tyson. An absolute ghost of a peak Mike Tyson for me. This is a Mike Tyson who was close to getting beat by a guy like Danny Williams and Kevin McBride. If I recall, those defeats to Williams and McBride occurred in 2003 and 2004. This fight from Mike Tyson and Lewis was in 2002, so closer to that. I still think, despite the fact that this was a long way away from being a peak Tyson, I still think that he showed a few signs in this fight to indicate that he could have caused Lennox problems. So let's talk about those. Even though it was restrained to a round or two, in this fight Tyson did show that he could potentially get inside on Lennox Lewis. There are notable instances in the fight where Lennox goes to hold. If you look back at that Lennox Lewis versus David Tua fight, David Tua kind of adopted a similar approach to Mike Tyson. David Tua come forward, pressure fighter, shorter, got low, looked to get onto the inside. For me, Lennox Lewis was able to keep that David Tua long. He was able to keep that David Tua on the outside. Whereas in the Tyson fight, I think he struggled to do that to a greater extent. Even that ghost of Mike Tyson gave an indication that he could get inside. And I personally think that in the early rounds of that fight, Lewis also struggled ever so slightly with Mike's head movement. And let's have it right. The Mike head movement of 2002 was nothing like Mike's head movement in the late 80s. I think we can all agree on that. But Tyson was a mobile fighter, and he was a mobile fighter in many ways. His feet were mobile, his upper body was mobile, his head was mobile. He was bending at the waist, he was dipping, he was bobbing and weaving, that famous peekaboo style. Even in 2002, for me, I think Lennox took a while to adjust to Mike Tyson, to that head movement, to that aggression, to that ability to get on the inside. Lennox possibly lost the first round, possibly looked a little bit uncomfortable, had to resort to holding. And to a large extent, Mike Tyson showed that he could take a lot of Lennox Lewis's punches in that 2002 fight. Now, don't get me wrong. Lennox wins the fight in dominant, decisive fashion and wins the fight by stoppage. And for what it's worth, could that fight have been stopped sooner? It probably could, because Tyson took some absolutely hellacious punches in that fight from Lennox Lewis. And whilst Tyson showed he had the chin to take some of those punches, it was a bit of a beating in those later rounds. So that's my take on that one. But I guess that fight, despite being of limited value from an evidence perspective, because it doesn't represent peak Tyson, it still gives us an indicator that if an old Mike Tyson was able to ask so many questions of Lennox, a peak Mike Tyson would have been able to answer real questions. And I think that's one of the interesting things about Lennox and Mike, is you kind of think of them as guys of the same era. But really, there's an argument to say that they were almost operating in different eras, because Mike Tyson's one of these guys. He was at his peak at a very, very young age. Mike Tyson was at his peak in his early 20s. Lennox, for me, is a guy who didn't mature till a lot later. And we've spoken about this before on the channel. Yes, like all men, Lennox was probably at his athletic peak earlier on, in his early to mid-20s when he was with Pepe Correa. Maybe he was a more athletic individual than we saw later on in his career. But for me, in terms of Lennox's actually boxing peak, he probably didn't hit that until a couple of years after he joined with Manny Stewart. Manny Stewart, for me, almost reinvented the wheel with Lennox Lewis. You look at Lennox early on in his career, you look back to that Frank Bruno first fight, you look at was it the Derek Williams fight? Lennox, for me, is an ungainly fighter back then. He's a guy who's not so confident on the inside. He's a guy who's a bit off balance. He's a guy who isn't really as smooth as we come to associate with Lennox of later years. So it's interesting, because even though these guys are considered in the same era, really Mike Tyson was at his peak in the late 80s. For me, Lennox was a guy coming into his peak in the late 90s, really. I know there isn't the hugest age gap between the two. Lennox is a guy who, for me, was on the scene later than Mike and probably peaked more like late 20s into 30 years old, whereas Tyson was at that peak sort of in the early half of his 20s, as I've said. So, there is a big gap between that Mike Tyson, let's say, of 1988 and Lennox Lewis of 2000 and Tyson of 2002. That's 14 years. A lot of boxing careers come and go in 14 years. But this was the fight of an era. This was the sort of Floyd Manny of the time. And I think even though the common consensus amongst boxing fans was that this wasn't the Mike Tyson of old, because of the celebrity between the two guys and because of the urge to see the two guys fight, all that kind of went to one side for a time being. And with Mike Tyson's aura, his reputation, his bad man image, I think there was still excitement around seeing the fight, despite the fact that Lennox, was at that point much closer to his prime, if not in his prime, compared to an aging Mike Tyson. And sometimes when I look back on that fight, and I'll speak about Lennox Lewis's legacy later on in this video, but you look at Lennox and he kind of appears a bit bitter towards Mike Tyson. I think a large portion of that is, for Lennox, this was the culmination of his career from a celebrity standpoint. I'm not saying it was the culmination from a boxing standpoint, but he wanted that fight with Tyson. he wanted to answer that question. He wanted to go down as the number one of an era. And I think for him, it was a great disappointment that he finally got that fight with Mike Tyson. Yeah, this fight was talked about for years. I think Tyson actually, I believe, paid Lennox Lewis step-aside money because he wanted to take another fight earlier on in his career against Evander Holyfield. Yeah, was that a dark? No. Evander Holyfield was just a bigger name at the time. That was the biggest fight in heavyweight boxing, whereas Lennox was newer on the scene. Yeah, but Lennox had wanted that fight for a long time. It was the culmination of his celebrity, if you like. And then probably after the fight, a lot of people discredited it by saying, Mike Tyson was too old and too past his peak. So I can understand why Lennox was bitter about that. I guess from his perspective, that was the culmination of his career. That seemed like the final big win to go for. And, maybe people were too disparaging about the performance based on the fact that Tyson was old. But yeah, there we go. That's the definition of the peak. So I guess an introductory analysis would be, my thinking is that, Tyson of 88 was a much more dynamic fighter than Tyson of 2002. The speed was at a different level. The explosiveness was at a different level. Defensively, he was a lot more responsible. I've said before on this channel, but I will say it again. For me, Tyson's style is one of the hardest styles to master if you are in any way unfit or not fully dedicated to the sport. Some of these smooth outside boxers, right? They can put on a little bit of weight. They can get themselves a little bit unfit. And when they get back into the ring, they've got those fundamentals. They're long guys. They've got big range. They can stick out a jab, go for a bit of a walk, stick out a jab. Mike Tyson, very, very opposite. He is the most explosive fighter. You try boxing the peekaboo style, be it as explosive like Mike Tyson for 3 intense minutes on a heavy back. You'll know exactly what I'm talking about. The output, the changing of levels, the bending at the knees, the bending at the waist, the head movement, the barrage of power punches. That is something that you have to be super fit, super committed in order to master. And with Tyson's problems, well-documented problems throughout the course of his career, with the fact that he'd blown up in weight once or twice, he'd obviously had the time in prison, he'd been living that celebrity lifestyle, let's just say. We saw that style really start to wane, especially the defensive element, and for me, that meant Tyson became a lot more beatable fighter at that stage of his career. It really did. Lewis, I see as a guy who's potentially vulnerable to a fighter who brings the Mike Tyson approach. Now, when I did the initial video all those years ago, I based that opinion on the fact that he looked vulnerable in the Tyson fight. Now, having watched a bit more Lewis, I continue to think that he looks uncomfortable on the inside, but I continue to do that having done a bit more research. I've watched the Ray Mercer fight. Ray Mercer, another big, long guy. But if you watch that fight, he takes the fight to Lennox Lewis. He drags that one into the trenches. He's not just standing off and jabbing with Lennox Lewis. That's a close fight. That's a fight where Lewis is caused real problems by the approach that Ray Mercer adopts. Look at the Derek Williams fight that I've already referenced. Tyson, you look at his vulnerabilities. Is he vulnerable to that James Tillis outside style? Would he be vulnerable to like a Muhammad Ali style? Absolutely. Is he also vulnerable to the Evander Holyfield style? Or the style that Evander Holyfield fought against Mike Tyson, where Holyfield just ran at him and met him straight in the middle? Absolutely. Tyson's got his own vulnerabilities. But for me, looking at the two guys, I think in a question of styles make fights, I think that Tyson's vulnerabilities would be less likely exploited by Lewis than Lewis's vulnerabilities would be exploited by Mike. I just don't think that Lennox would have been able to live with that inside approach that Mike Tyson was able to adopt, compared to, I do think Tyson would have been able to deal with Lennox. If I look at Lennox's skills, was Lennox going to be that outside back foot boxer like James Tillis was? Probably not, not to that same slippery extent. Would Lennox have brought the fight up close like Evander Holyfield did? I doubt it. I see Lennox wanting to fight that fight like he did the David Tua match, and I see Tyson probably being able to get inside. And I think Tyson's getting low head movement approach would mean Lennox would struggle to land a jab to keep him off. And I think when Tyson was on the inside, I think Lennox would get very, very uncomfortable indeed there. People talk about Lennox Lewis having questionable punch resistance. I'm not so sure about that. I think Lennox is a guy who got complacent in a few fights. I think he got caught with a few punches from lesser fighters like Rackman and McCall that he really didn't see coming, and that he potentially overlooked. And I think there was a few sloppy moments in Lennox's career where, yes, he did get caught. But I've also seen Lennox in with some big punches, and I've seen Lennox taking punches straight on the whiskers. And I do think, that Lennox's chin is probably better than some of his detractors think it is. But that Tyson at his best was a relentless fighter. He was brutal on the inside. And the question is, would Lennox have been able to come up with a style to stop him from implementing that game plan? And I'm not sure he would have done. Balance of probability. My instinct is that Lennox wouldn't have found that style. Lennox wouldn't have suddenly, been as evasive as a James Tillis. Lennox wouldn't have suddenly developed a sort of balls to the wall inside approach like Evander Holyfield did. I think Lennox would be looking to box from sort of mid to outside range. I think he'd be looking to catch Tyson coming in, and I think he'd struggle with that, and I think Tyson would prove the better man. Generally, Lewis, generally for me, Lewis would be vulnerable to that inside fighter, I think. But generally, I would say that 9 times out of 10, a really good boxer from like Lennox who could beat a guy like Mike Tyson from the outside. The typical consensus in boxing, sorry, I'm stumbling over my words there. What I'm trying to say is the typical consensus in boxing is that a good boxer beats a sort of come forward presser fighter, if you like. And I think 9 times out of 10 that is the case. The guy with the better movement, the guy with the better range, the guy with the better jab, the guy with the better straight outside punches, really, really does have advantages in boxing. And a guy who comes forward and who's able to bully and presser is a scary opponent. But often at the elite level, they're guys who get caught coming in. They're guys who get countered. They're guys who are maybe a bit reckless defensively and maybe don't have a plan B if they're kept long. Picture, if you will, the way Floyd Mayweather dealt with someone like a Ricky Hatton or dealt with someone like a Marcus Maidana in their second fight, perhaps. But I do see Tyson as someone who would upset that equation a lot of the time because Tyson mastered that peekaboo style to a level that we probably haven't seen mastered since. And Tyson was so mobile, so explosive, and had that, at his best, had that combination of offense and defense at such an elite level, combined with such a good chin, that I do think he'd be too hard for Lennox to beat. If I talk about their respective ages, a lot of rumours about what went on in sparring between these two guys. A lot of rumours, about some of the early stories. Can I believe that Mike Tyson beat up Lennox Lewis in sparring? I absolutely can. Tyson at that young age, I could see very, very easily being able to beat an early career Lennox Lewis. Because you look at that early career Lennox Lewis, and as I say, it took him a long time to mature. It took him a long time to grow into himself. And I believe his boxing peak came when he was with Manny Stewart for a few years. So do I believe an early Mike Tyson could have walked through an early Lennox Lewis? Absolutely. Things get more interesting if you start talking about that mid-90s period, because that's when Lennox is starting to come into his peak, and that's when the signs of Mike Tyson starting to decline are becoming more and more obvious. But for me, by the time 2002 comes around, Lennox is clearly the better man, and Tyson's got that kind of style that probably doesn't age well, and we've talked about that a few times in the channel. But for me, guys who rely on athleticism, explosiveness, those sort of attributes are always going to age worse than guys who rely on outside boxing technique and fundamentals and that pedigree, if you like. So, my take is that Tyson in the 80s, 90s, early 90s would be the better man out of the two. By the time you get to that mid-90s period, it's competitive, and there's a point where it crosses over where Lennox becomes more in his peak with Manny Stewart, and that's when I'd start picking him to beat Tyson at that stage. But prime for prime, if we're talking late 80s Tyson versus late 90s Lewis, I am going to go with Iron Mike. That's what I'm going to say on that front. Let's talk about legacies. Let's talk about resumes. For my money, and I am going to pull them up on BoxRec because they've both got such extended resumes that it's hard to compare without listing the two up. For my money, who goes down as having the better legacy? Who goes down as having the better list of opponents? It's got to be Lennox Lewis. Despite the fact I've just picked Tyson to beat him in a head-to-head peak v peak matchup. I mean, let's just read from Lennox's resume. Vitaly Klitschko, probably a top 20 all-time great. Controversial fight, Lennox wins. Mike Tyson, yes, past his peak. Controversial in that sense, but Lennox wins by stoppage. The win over Hassan Ratman and Oliver McCall, not vintage wins, but the fact that Lennox beat the two guys who beat him in his career, very, very solid. Wins over David Tua, Franz Bofa, Michael Grant, solid. 2 wins, a win and a draw, but we know about that draw against Holyfield. Shannon Briggs, Andrew Galotta, Henry Akinwande, Ray Mercer, we touched on that fight, majority decision. TKO against Tommy Morrison, that is a deep resume. KO over Bruno, UD over Tony Tucker, that devastating KO against Donovan Razor Ruddock. That is a deep, deep resume. I'm not a heavyweight boxing expert to the extent that my knowledge is at a point yet where I can say that is the 3rd best resume of all time. That is the 5th best resume of all time. But what I will say is that resume has got to be in the conversation as one of the strongest heavyweight resumes of all time. Of course, Muhammad Ali, you'd throw that in there. You'd maybe want to talk about the likes of a George Foreman. You'd talk about the longevity of guys like Joe Louis, Larry Holmes, those sort of names. But Lennox is right in that elite, if you want, of that conversation of some of the greatest heavyweights of all time, in my opinion. You look at Mike Tyson. For me, Mike Tyson goes down for me as someone who has a strong heavyweight resume, but it's probably slightly lighter than Lennox's. I think his legacy in the sport is potentially stronger than Lennox's, because I think the celebrity around Tyson's name, the amount of headlines, the amount of news stories, the fact that he's become such a popular figure outside of the ring, that style that he brought, I think Tyson will probably be remembered more. I think Tyson has probably become a sort of cult figure and referred to in popular culture more. If we look at Tyson's resume, again, there's great names in there. Razor Ruddock, Bruno, Spinks, Tubbs, Holmes, Tucker, Pinklon Thomas, Burbick, more names towards the end of his career as well. But Tyson probably lacks the all-time great wins that Lennox has. I mean, yes, he's got the win over Larry Holmes. Obviously, that was the ghost of Larry Holmes. But Lennox got the wins over, like an Evander Holyfield, Ray Mercer. I'm not saying Ray Mercer was top tier all-time great, but Vitali, I know that was a controversial win, but nevertheless. My point is they both have strong resumes. For me, Lennox has the stronger resume. Mike Tyson probably has what would go down as the bigger name value in the sport, the guy who's more popular, the guy who's referred to the most. In the build-up to recording this video, I've rewatched a lot of Lennox Lewis interviews, a lot of Lennox Lewis fights. I've heard Lennox talk about, that Tyson fight quite a lot. And Lennox, for me, he does come across averagely in certain interviews. I'll put it that way. He comes across as someone who is, very, very, very bitter at times and, really, really desperate to make clear he was one of the greatest of all time. Whereas a guy like Mike Tyson, he's maybe got that confidence because of his name value where he doesn't feel the need to justify himself a bit more. So I watched, and it's on YouTube, I watched the video with Lennox. I think it was like a ringside special with Johnny Nelson and Adam Smith. And, for me, I look at that and there was a lot of excuses in there. At one point he was asked about the Ray Mercer fight and, the performance in that fight. He blamed it on the fact the ring was small and said, that gave an advantage to Ray Mercer. He was then asked about the Vitaly Klitschko fight. He referenced that fight would have been an easy win if the stoppage didn't come when it did. Kind of rewriting history a little bit there. He was asked about the Rackman fight. He said that was a lucky punch. Rackman didn't know what he was doing. Then he said altitude was a factor. Well, it's either one or the other. If it was just a lucky punch and Rackman didn't even know he was throwing it, it was some kind of freak incident, why was altitude a factor? He talked about Oliver McCall fight. He said it was a fast count. He wasn't happy with the stoppage. He was then asked, what was the toughest fight? And he said, there wasn't really anyone on my level. The hardest part for me was the training. Mike Tyson, I've heard him refer to Mike Tyson as one-dimensional. All you needed to do was time him with the uppercut. For me, when you look at those kind of interviews, Lennox possibly doesn't do himself any favours. If I was talking up my legacy, my resume, I'd be wanting to make my opponents look as devastating as possible. I'd be saying, that Ray Mercer fight was a hell of a fight. I had to really dig in and show heart to win that one. I'd be saying, Mike Tyson was a beast. That goes down as one of my big name victories. I'd be saying, the Vitaly Klitschko wasn't an easy fight at all. That was the last fight of my career. That was on my way out of the sport, and I had to dig in for one last time as a champion. But Lennox kind of doesn't come across in that way. He's bitter about his status as a unified champ. There's been this recent, relatively high-profile Twitter exchange with a TV network who said that he wasn't a unified champ because he didn't hold the WBO belt. And you kind of wonder, why is Lennox taking to Twitter to have it out with a TV network? He's achieved so much in his career. Does it even really matter? He also has been critical on a few occasions about the current crop of heavyweight champions, and he sort of indicates on a few occasions that they're not on his level. So for me, Lennox is one of these guys who maybe hasn't been the most graceful of retirement. Maybe it's been a case where he's felt the need to justify his status and, make clear how great he thought he was too many times and too often in retirement. If I look at Mike interviews, he's more even these days. He's more self-assured with his own status in the sport and his own history and reputation within the game, that he doesn't feel the need to justify that. And, I think that contributes. You see Mike Tyson on all sorts of media now. I know Lennox Lewis has done a few films over the years, but I saw Tyson in The Hangover. You see Tyson being used more regularly by certain broadcasters, etc. And I think basically the way I sum it up is this. The night Lennox and Tyson fought, Lennox was conclusively the better man. In terms of who will go down as a greater heavyweight, in terms of resume, in terms of achievements, it'll be Lennox. But who will go down as the better known boxer? Who will go down as the more popular culture figure? Who will go down more as an idol of the sport? It'll be Mike Tyson. It'll be because of that charisma inside, outside of the ring. It'll be because of the antics. It'll be because of the style. It'll be because of the explosiveness. And it will be because of the crazy, crazy life that Mike Tyson has led. Tyson goes down from a celebrity perspective. Lennox probably goes down from a pure boxing resume perspective. Peak v peak, I'm with Tyson. It's all about styles. Styles make fights. Yes, Tyson was vulnerable. Yes, Tyson was beatable. But if I look at the ways to beat Mike Tyson, I think you either got to go very much on the outside and be dancing all night, or you've got to be very much on the inside and going to war. And I don't think either of those suited Lennox. I think Tyson would be able to get in on Lennox. I think Tyson did so in that 2002 fight, that he could take big punches from Lennox. And all in all, I think the offensive destructiveness of a peak Mike Tyson would be too much for the vast majority of fighters, and I include Lennox Lewis on that. That's my take. It's a controversial subject. On this topic, you're only ever going to please 50% of people. There'll be certain comments on these videos. Tyson, 9 times out of 10. Lennox every day of the week. Lennox Lewis, easy. You get comments like this. The educated boxing fans know that if this fight happened, there isn't an easy winner. They will know that you can't predict with any certainty. They will know that when you're talking a fight at this level, it's always a difficult fight to call. But I'm going with Tyson. Thanks for tuning in. Hope you enjoyed the video.